Neka ran her fingers over the small pouch, feeling the weight of the gold that had been hidden from her sight for so long. Each coin and nugget gleamed faintly in the dim sunlight that filtered through the small window of her family's modest home, reflecting memories of her mother's warm hands and gentle voice. This was more than wealth to her. It was a tangible connection to the woman who had shaped her values, taught her to speak with honesty and to see beyond appearances. Her mother had always emphasized that character outweighed possessions, yet she had left this treasure carefully hidden, a reminder of love and foresight intertwined. Growing up, Neka had learned to balance intelligence with empathy. She knew the importance of observing quietly, of listening before speaking, and of weighing her actions with deliberate care. In a household that often overlooked her quiet presence, these traits had become her greatest strengths. The discovery of the gold was both a surprise and a responsibility. It was a secret she felt compelled to protect, not for her own greed, but because it carried the weight of her family's legacy and the memory of her mother's wisdom. Neka's father, Obinna, had always been a commanding figure in the household. He was respected by the villagers for his authority and the family's modest standing, yet beneath his public demeanor lay a man whose ambition sometimes blurred the lines between pride and selfishness. Neka had long sensed that her father valued appearances and reputation more than transparency. Though she loved him, she could not ignore the subtle hints of secrecy that had shaped her childhood. This gold, hidden by her mother, was a silent testament to a truth her father had never fully acknowledged. Wealth without honesty was hollow, and trust could not be bought or stolen. In the quiet mornings, Neka would sit by the small clay hearth, the pouch of gold beside her, and think of the lessons her mother had taught her. She remembered the afternoons spent learning to weave baskets, to cook with patience, and to speak plainly even when her words carried the weight of disappointment. These lessons had shaped her not just into a careful observer but into someone who could recognize value beyond material wealth. The gold in her hands was more than coins. It was a test, a legacy, and a responsibility she could not take lightly. Her neighbors often underestimated her, seeing only a young woman from a modest household. They did not know the depth of her intelligence, the quiet strength that had allowed her to navigate the subtle currents of family dynamics, or the sharp eye that caught inconsistencies others overlooked. Neka understood the fragility of trust, the importance of timing, and the power of patience. Each decision she made regarding the gold would ripple outward, affecting not only her relationship with her father but the integrity of the family she held dear. Despite the allure of wealth, Neka felt no rush to flaunt it. She examined each piece carefully, noting its markings, its texture, and the faint traces of her mother's careful handling. She whispered small prayers of gratitude for the guidance her mother had left behind and promised herself she would honor that trust. In the stillness of her room, she began to formulate plans: how to safeguard the gold, how to ensure it served as a reminder of truth rather than a source of greed, and how to navigate the delicate balance between familial loyalty and moral responsibility. Neka's discovery was the beginning of a journey that would test her intelligence, courage, and integrity. The gold was not merely a reward or inheritance. It was a mirror reflecting the values her mother had instilled and a challenge that would reveal the character of those around her. As she held the small pouch close, feeling its weight and significance, she knew that the path ahead required careful thought, unwavering honesty, and the courage to confront truths long buried. Her heart swelled with determination, for she understood that preserving her mother's legacy meant more than guarding gold. It meant protecting the principles and wisdom that had shaped her very being. The next morning, Neka awoke with a sense of purpose, intending to review the small pouch of gold once more. But when she reached for it, her fingers closed around empty air. The pouch, once carefully nestled beneath her mother's old blanket, was gone. A chill ran down her spine and her mind raced through the possibilities. She knew without a doubt that no one else in the house would have taken it without her noticing. Her gaze shifted to her father, Obinna, who sat across the room reading a worn ledger with an intensity that seemed almost forced. At first, she tried to convince herself it was a simple mistake. Perhaps she had misplaced the pouch. But deep down, a growing unease told her otherwise. Obinna's behavior over the past few days began to replay in her mind. His unusually long absences in the evenings, the furtive glances when she entered the room, and the stiffness in his movements when anyone mentioned the family's modest wealth. Each memory, once easily dismissed, now seemed like a calculated signal of deception. When she confronted him casually at breakfast, asking where the gold had gone, his eyes flickered with something she could not immediately identify, a mix of surprise, guilt and careful calculation. "The gold?" he asked, his voice calm but strained. "I thought you had it with you." "I moved it for safekeeping. I didn't want it to get lost." His words sounded rehearsed, a thin veil over something heavier, something unspoken. Nneka studied her father's expression closely. The way his lips pressed together, the faint tremor in his hands as he poured water into her cup, and the slight avoidance of eye contact all sent signals she could not ignore. She had been raised to notice these things, trained in the subtleties of observation by her mother's quiet teachings. Her instincts, honed through years of careful attention, screamed that this explanation was only a fragment of the truth. Throughout the day, Nneka observed Obinna with heightened awareness. He moved through the house with deliberate caution, checking drawers and cupboards she had never considered before. He lingered near her room longer than necessary and avoided conversations where the gold might be mentioned. Each act, subtle yet deliberate, reinforced her growing suspicion. The gold had been taken not for protection, but for reasons he was determined to conceal. Despite her rising doubts, Nneka remained outwardly composed. She knew that acting in haste or accusing him directly could provoke a defensive response, closing off avenues to the truth. Instead, she began forming a mental map of his movements, noting patterns and discrepancies, storing every detail for later. She observed how he interacted with the neighbors, the timing of his visits to the market, and even the way he handled seemingly innocuous chores around the house. Every small action was a thread, weaving a larger picture of his deception. By evening, the unease in her chest had solidified into quiet determination. The gold was more than a treasure. It was a symbol of trust between her mother and herself. Its disappearance revealed fractures not just in her father's actions, but in the moral framework of the household. Nneka resolved that she would uncover the full truth, not through confrontation alone, but through careful observation, patience, and strategy. Obinna's tense, evasive behavior had lit the spark of investigation within her, and she knew that the journey to uncover the reality behind the missing gold was only beginning. Each creak of the floorboards, every glance exchanged, and each whispered word would become pieces of the puzzle she was determined to solve. Late one evening, after her father had retired to his room and the household had settled into quiet, Nneka began a careful search of the spaces her father frequented most. She moved with the precision and patience that had been cultivated by years of observing both the rhythms of her home and the subtle signs of her father's secrecy. She ran her fingers along the walls, examining cracks, loose bricks, and worn wooden panels that had long gone unnoticed. Her instincts told her that the gold's disappearance was only a fragment of a larger truth, something her mother had perhaps known and silently warned her about. As her fingers traced the edges of an old fireplace in the back room, a structure that had seemed ordinary for decades, she felt the slight give of a brick that didn't sit flush with its neighbors. Her heart quickened with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. Carefully, she dislodged it, revealing a narrow cavity within the wall. Inside, wrapped in a thin layer of cloth, was a small folded piece of paper. The edges were yellowed, the ink faded slightly, yet unmistakably neat and deliberate. It bore her mother's familiar handwriting. Nneka's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the note, and a faint scent of her mother's familiar lavender perfume seemed to linger in the air. The words on the paper were not about the gold itself, but rather hinted at a far deeper betrayal, a secret that reached beyond the simple act of taking wealth. Her mother's careful script warned of decisions made under pressure, deals struck in shadows, and choices that had endangered not only the family's honor but the well-being of the village itself. It was a warning, a guide, and a key to understanding motives long hidden behind smiles and polite words. The note's message was cryptic but urgent. It suggested that the theft of the gold was a symptom of something greater, an attempt to conceal evidence of a wrongdoing that, if discovered, could shatter reputations and disrupt the delicate balance of relationships within the family and the village. Nneka read slowly, absorbing each phrase, each implication. Her mother's words carried the weight of foreknowledge, a careful mapping of moral dangers and potential betrayals. "Not all that is taken is gold," one line read. "Some treasures are hidden in plain sight and some sins are buried in silence. Watch, listen, and do not let shadows deceive your heart." The note also hinted at timing and the importance of patience. Her mother instructed Neka to observe first, to gather evidence, and to discern intention before taking any action. There was a palpable sense of trust embedded in the message. The mother had relied on her daughter's intelligence and judgment to navigate a moral labyrinth that had long been hidden from view. This trust weighed heavily on Neka, filling her with a sense of responsibility as intense as the unease stirred by her father's deception. Hours passed as Neka studied the note, comparing its subtle clues to events she had witnessed over the past weeks. She began to connect the dots. The father's evasive behavior, the strange disappearances of certain items around the house, and even the whispered stories from neighbors that hinted at a scandal no one dared speak aloud. The note was both a revelation and a roadmap, guiding her through a hidden terrain of past wrongs, present deception, and potential consequences. By the time she returned the note carefully to its hiding place, Neka felt a mixture of clarity and resolve. She now understood that her father's theft of the gold was not a mere act of greed. It was a piece of a far larger puzzle, a mechanism to obscure a crime that threatened the foundation of her family and the moral fabric of the village. The hidden note had illuminated a path, offering both caution and direction. As she lay awake that night, Neka knew that uncovering the truth would require more than confrontation. It would demand intelligence, patience, and the courage to face a betrayal far deeper than she had ever imagined. The gold was only the surface. Beneath it lay secrets her mother had trusted her to reveal. Neka held the folded note carefully, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. Each line of her mother's handwriting seemed to pulse with urgency, carrying not only the weight of truth but the quiet authority of someone who had seen far beyond the ordinary bounds of daily life. The words hinted at a dark history, one that had been buried beneath years of civility and respectability, yet could no longer remain hidden. Her mother's warning spoke of Obinna, Neka's father, not merely as a man who had taken gold in secret, but as someone who had participated in a grave misdeed many years prior. The crime was not petty. It had rippled through the village, affecting countless lives and endangering the family's honor. Neka's mind raced as she recalled the fragments of whispered conversations she had overheard in the past, the hesitant words of villagers who had looked away, and the subtle tension that always seemed to linger in her father's presence when the topic of wealth, property, or family legacy arose. The note did not detail the crime fully but gave enough hints to make the implications clear. It described a betrayal carried out under the cover of respectability that had harmed innocent villagers and shifted the balance of trust in the community. Her mother had written that the event had been kept secret, covered by lies and misdirection, with only those who were intimately aware of the family's inner workings able to piece together the truth. Neka realized that her father's theft of the gold was linked to this hidden crime, likely a means to conceal evidence or prevent the exposure of his actions. The mother's words carried both caution and strategy. She instructed Neka to proceed with wisdom and patience, emphasizing that the truth, though powerful, must be revealed with care. A reckless accusation could provoke denial, defensiveness, and even further concealment, potentially making the situation worse. The note underscored the need for observation, documentation, and the careful gathering of evidence, a methodical approach that her mother trusted Neka to follow. As Neka read further, she felt the full weight of responsibility settle upon her shoulders. The note made it clear that the family's reputation, the well-being of the village, and the integrity of her own character depended on how she handled what she had discovered. The warning was more than a cautionary message. It was a call to action, a guide for navigating a delicate moral and social labyrinth. Her mother trusted her not only to see the truth but to wield it wisely, ensuring that justice could be served without unnecessary harm. The warning also contained subtle advice about resilience and inner strength. Her mother reminded her that facing the truth required courage, and that wisdom often came not from immediate confrontation, but from careful consideration of timing and consequence. Neka understood that she could not rely solely on emotion. She would need to marshal her intelligence, patience, and analytical skills to uncover the full extent of her father's wrongdoing and to act in a way that honored both justice and the family's legacy. By the time Neka folded the note back and tucked it safely into her hand, she felt a profound mixture of fear, sorrow, and determination. She knew that her father's secret was far more dangerous and complex than the missing gold had initially suggested. The path ahead would demand caution, strategy, and unwavering resolve. The mother's warning was a lantern in the darkness, illuminating the treacherous terrain of deceit and betrayal that had been hidden beneath the surface of her family's household for years. Nneka understood that she was now entrusted not just with gold but with the truth, a truth powerful enough to shake the foundation of her family and the village, if handled without care. Nneka sat quietly by the window, the faint glow of the evening sun filtering through the cracks in the wooden shutters. In her lap rested the small note, worn from repeated reading, its words still vivid in her mind. She had spent the better part of the day reflecting on her mother's warnings and observing her father's subtle behaviors, trying to reconcile the two streams of knowledge. As she traced the events of the past weeks and months, a pattern began to emerge, a hidden thread connecting the disappearance of the gold to something far more significant than simple greed. She remembered the evenings when Obinna would leave the house abruptly, claiming trivial errands or business matters, and return with his mood unusually subdued. There had been nights when she heard murmured conversations through the walls, hushed voices that stopped as soon as she approached. Then there were the times when neighbors seemed unusually cautious around him, avoiding his gaze or speaking in riddles about past incidents. Each memory, once isolated and seemingly inconsequential, now fell into place like pieces of a larger puzzle. The note had hinted at a crime that had affected the village, something deliberately hidden from public view, and Nneka began to connect this warning with her father's recent actions. The gold, she realized, was not taken merely as a selfish indulgence or a desire for personal wealth. It was a tool of concealment, a means to hide evidence or prevent discovery. Perhaps it was linked to records, letters, or artifacts that could expose the truth, much like the note itself had done. The act of taking the gold was strategic, designed to obscure knowledge, and it became clear to Nneka that understanding her father's motives required untangling a web of past actions and consequences. She thought back to subtle incidents from her childhood, small favors requested of her, secrets whispered in confidence, and unexplained tensions that had colored family interactions. Each fragment seemed minor at the time but now suggested a carefully maintained pattern of deception. Her mother's handwriting in the note had emphasized observation and patience, and she realized that these past events were pieces of evidence that could illuminate the true scope of Obinna's wrongdoing. Nneka began to chart a mental map of the situation, noting discrepancies, inconsistencies, and the gaps in explanations her father had given over the years. Every evasive answer, every unaccounted absence, and every vague denial began to take on meaning. She saw how the gold had become a symbol, a marker of trust manipulated, a tangible piece used to divert attention from a hidden misdeed. The pattern was undeniable. Her father's greed was entwined with guilt, and the theft of the gold was a calculated act to maintain secrecy and safeguard his reputation at the expense of truth. As the evening deepened, Nneka's resolve solidified. The puzzle, once obscure and fragmented, had begun to reveal its edges, outlining the shadowy shape of her father's actions. The gold was a clue, a surface distraction that pointed to a deeper betrayal, one that demanded careful unraveling. With her mother's note as guidance, Nneka prepared herself for the next steps, observing, confirming, and gathering the pieces necessary to expose the full story. The journey was no longer about lost wealth. It was about uncovering justice, understanding motives, and confronting a truth that had long been hidden beneath the veneer of familial duty and appearances. Each connection she made brought her closer to comprehending the extent of the deception, and with that comprehension came the clarity to act wisely. Nneka moved carefully through the village, walking along familiar paths that now seemed charged with hidden meaning. She had begun to notice things she had overlooked before, lingering glances from neighbors, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached, and the subtle shifts in body language that spoke volumes. The village, once a place of ordinary daily life, had become a repository of half-spoken truths, whispers that, when pieced together, could reveal the full story of her father's deception. At the market, she overheard the careful choice of words from two elderly women discussing past events. "It's been years," one murmured, glancing at Nneka with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "But some debts, some sins, they do not vanish with time." Nneka noted the phrasing, the careful avoidance of direct accusation, and the tension underlying their casual tone. It was a hint, a fragment of information that could be aligned with what she already knew from her mother's note and her own observations. In the evenings she would sit quietly at the edge of the village square, listening to stories passed among the villagers. Children's tales, gossip shared over cooking fires, and comments meant to warn or advise all contained subtle truths. One story spoke of a wealthy merchant who had been defrauded long ago, with hints that the family of Neka's father had benefited indirectly. Another mentioned mysterious disappearances of small but significant objects, never traced to their true origin. Each piece of the narrative, when collected, formed a mosaic of Obina's past actions and their ripple effects throughout the community. Some villagers were cautious to speak, wary of potential consequences. Their eyes often darted toward Obina's house, and their voices dropped to a whisper as they offered vague insights. "He has always been careful," one man said. "Not all that seems innocent is so." Neka listened attentively, sensing that fear had silenced many truths over the years. Yet even the cautious phrasing held information for those willing to observe and interpret. Every carefully chosen word, every subtle hesitation, was a piece of the puzzle she was assembling. At her father's place of work, Neka spoke with a few trusted acquaintances under the guise of casual conversation. Slowly, patterns emerged, discrepancies between what had been reported and what she now understood to be reality. Rumors of financial manipulation, past favors that had favored certain families over others, and decisions that seemed minor but had significant consequences all pointed toward a broader betrayal. It became clear that Obina's actions had not been isolated incidents. They were part of a calculated pattern designed to protect himself and his family at the expense of fairness and transparency. Neka began recording these conversations discreetly, noting the names, events, and implied connections. The whispers of the village were like pieces of an ancient tapestry, threads that, once woven together, revealed the true shape of events long hidden. Each fragment of gossip, each careful hint, was a reflection of both truth and fear. Fear of reprisal, fear of scandal, and fear of disrupting the delicate balance of social hierarchy. By the time night fell, Neka had a clearer picture of her father's betrayal and its wide-reaching impact. She understood that the gold was merely a symbol, a cover for actions that had harmed more than just the family's reputation. Villagers' whispers confirmed what her mother's note had implied. Obina's crime had created ripples that affected trust, relationships, and the moral fabric of the community. The investigation had revealed a network of truths, small yet powerful, and Neka realized that the path ahead required not just confrontation, but careful consideration of how the revelation of these secrets would reshape the village and her family alike. Neka stood in the quiet of the family home, the evening sun casting long shadows across the room. In her hands rested the small worn note from her mother, and in her mind replayed the careful observations, whispered conversations, and subtle hints she had gathered from the village. Each detail had been meticulously pieced together, forming a web of evidence that pointed unmistakably to her father's hidden betrayal. The time had come to confront Obina, not with anger alone, but with the clarity of truth and the weight of undeniable proof. Obina sat in his usual chair by the fire, pretending to read a ledger, his brow furrowed in concentration. Neka approached slowly, her steps measured, her expression calm but resolute. She began with quiet questions, simple at first, probing his awareness of the gold, the timing of his movements, and the discrepancies she had noticed over the past weeks. Obina responded with practiced calm, deflecting, minimizing, and maintaining a facade of innocence. But Neka's careful preparation allowed her to remain composed, to notice the subtle tremor in his hands, the slight narrowing of his eyes, and the micro-expressions that betrayed more than his words ever could. As she continued, Neka produced the note, letting him see the familiar handwriting of her late mother. She read aloud the carefully chosen lines, the warnings and observations that detailed not only the theft of the gold but hinted at the deeper crime that had long been concealed. Obina's hands twitched at the sight of the note, a flicker of recognition passing across his face. His breathing became uneven, and for the first time, Neka noticed a shadow of fear in his eyes. She pressed on, connecting each piece of evidence she had collected. The missing gold, the villagers' whispers, the subtle inconsistencies in his past statements, and the patterns she had traced to past events. Neka's tone was firm but measured, each question designed to elicit truth without inciting defensiveness. She maintained eye contact, her gaze unwavering, conveying both authority and quiet disappointment. the weight of accumulated facts pressed upon him, creating an invisible pressure that words alone could not express. At first, Obinna continued to deny, insisting that he had only acted out of concern for the family's safety, that the gold had been moved to protect it, and that any missteps were unintentional. But Nneka remained steadfast, calmly dismantling each excuse with evidence and reason. She recounted the villager's cautious statements, the inconsistencies in his movements, and the implications of the note from her mother. The combined force of observation, testimony, and maternal guidance was undeniable. Slowly the cracks in his facade widened. His voice faltered, words stumbled, and the carefully maintained armor of denial began to crumble. The tension in the room grew palpable, as if the very walls were aware of the truth being forced into the light. Finally, with a deep exhale and a look of resignation, Obinna's defenses broke. He confessed, his voice heavy with guilt and shame, recounting the choices he had made, the acts he had concealed, and the consequences he had tried to hide. The confession was complete and unvarnished, laying bare both the theft of the gold and the deeper betrayal that had affected the village. Nneka listened intently, her expression composed yet tinged with sorrow. She allowed him to speak fully, understanding that the release of truth was both a punishment and a relief. The burden of secrecy, the weight of lies, and the fear of exposure had defined his actions for years. By confronting him with evidence, patience, and reason, she had forced the shadow of deception into the light. When the confession concluded, a profound silence filled the room. Nneka's careful planning, relentless observation, and the guidance from her mother's note had succeeded. Obinna's admission was not just a personal reckoning. It was the first step toward restoring integrity to the family and acknowledging the broader consequences of his betrayal. In that quiet, weighty moment, Nneka realized that truth, when approached with patience and wisdom, held the power to dismantle even the most carefully constructed deceptions. As Obinna's confession unfolded, Nneka felt a mixture of shock, sorrow, and a hard-edged clarity settle over her. The theft of her gold had been just the surface of a far deeper, darker deception. Her father had not only misappropriated family wealth but had been involved in a scheme years ago that had harmed the village itself. The stolen gold was intended to cover evidence, a tangible symbol used to divert attention from the betrayal that had quietly shaped the community's lives. The full extent of the crime was staggering. Obinna had manipulated village funds, redirecting resources that were meant to support communal projects and aid vulnerable families. There were whispers of falsified documents, hidden accounts, and carefully concealed transactions designed to protect his reputation while others suffered in silence. Worse, some villagers had been misled to take blame for acts they did not commit, their lives quietly upended by the careful machinations of a man who wore respectability like armor. Nneka listened as her father recounted each detail, the weight of his guilt palpable in the tremor of his voice. Understanding the practical implications of exposing the crime was immediate and pressing. The village's trust in her family had been built over generations. Revealing the truth risked scandal, resentment, and division. Families might turn against one another, and old alliances could fracture under the weight of betrayal. Yet the moral imperative was undeniable. Nneka realized that concealing the truth further would perpetuate harm, dishonor her mother's memory, and allow injustice to persist unchallenged. The stolen gold, once a private grievance, now symbolized the broader consequences of unchecked greed and secrecy. She also understood that the revelation carried personal stakes. Exposing her father meant redefining her own position within the family, balancing love and loyalty against the demands of integrity and justice. Nneka felt the gravity of her responsibility as if it rested upon her shoulders like a tangible weight. Her mother's note, the careful observations she had made, and the whispers she had gathered from the village all pointed to one unavoidable truth. The wrongdoing had to be addressed openly and wisely. As the night deepened, Nneka contemplated the sequence of actions necessary to unveil the secret without causing unnecessary harm. She would need to present evidence clearly, ensuring that the village understood the scope of the crime and the motives behind it. She would need to manage the consequences delicately, advocating for accountability while preserving the dignity of those who had been unwittingly harmed by Obinna's actions. Every decision required foresight, tact, and courage. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Nneka's resolve had crystallized. The full truth of Obina's crime was no longer hidden. It had been laid bare in her mind, catalogued and understood. The stolen gold, the secret ledger, the manipulated accounts, and the displaced trust all formed a single narrative of betrayal and its far-reaching consequences. She knew that revealing this secret would be neither simple nor painless, but it was essential. The moral and practical consequences of disclosure were immense, yet necessary, for justice for the village and for the preservation of her mother's legacy. Nneka understood that confronting the full scope of deceit was the only way to restore balance, honor and truth to a family and community long shadowed by lies. Nneka spent the following days in quiet deliberation, considering each step carefully before taking action. The weight of the truth pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she understood that revelation needed strategy, not impulsive exposure. She could not allow anger or humiliation to drive her decisions. The objective was justice, restoration, and balance. The stolen gold, the hidden crime, and the fractured trust all needed to be addressed in a way that would right the wrongs without irreparably harming those who were innocent or unaware. She began by organizing her evidence systematically, compiling the note from her mother, her own observations, and the corroborating details gathered from the villagers' whispers. Nneka also catalogued the sequence of her father's actions, demonstrating the chain of deceit and its tangible consequences. Her goal was not to shame him alone but to present the facts in a manner that would make the truth undeniable while emphasizing accountability and learning. Next, she considered the timing and setting. Nneka chose a gathering at the central village square, a place both symbolic and practical, where elders, neighbors and families could witness the revelation together. She knew that presenting the truth publicly would prevent selective interpretations, rumors, or manipulations from taking hold. Yet she also prepared a private conversation with her father beforehand, giving him the opportunity to accompany her in addressing the community with honesty. This approach would allow him to face the consequences with dignity, rather than being blindsided and humiliated. On the day of the gathering, Nneka arranged the stolen gold, now retrieved with her father's reluctant assistance, and other relevant documents in a visible manner. She began by recounting the events as neutrally as possible, framing them as facts rather than accusations. She explained the sequence of deception, connecting the missing gold to the larger scheme that had affected the village. The villagers listened, initially in disbelief as the evidence was laid out clearly and logically. Nneka emphasized the importance of accountability, not vengeance. She highlighted how the truth could heal the community and restore fairness, rather than deepen divisions or incite resentment. The stolen gold was returned to its rightful owners or managed to benefit those harmed by Obina's past actions, ensuring tangible restitution. By including practical measures alongside the moral revelations, Nneka helped the villagers see the path toward reconciliation rather than conflict. Throughout the process she maintained composure, her calm presence reinforcing the seriousness and impartiality of the message. Obina, guided by her steady demeanor, confessed openly and accepted responsibility for his actions. The villagers, initially skeptical, began to understand the full scope of the crime, recognizing both the severity of the betrayal and the care with which Nneka orchestrated its revelation. By the end of the day, justice had been partially restored. The stolen wealth was accounted for, the truth acknowledged, and Obina faced the necessary consequences while the family remained intact, though transformed by newfound transparency. Nneka's actions set a precedent. Truth handled wisely could correct wrongs, restore trust, and prevent further harm. The village began to perceive her not just as a daughter seeking justice, but as a guardian of moral integrity, capable of balancing courage, wisdom, and compassion in the pursuit of fairness. In that moment, Nneka realized that justice was more than punishment. It was restoration, education, and reconciliation. Her careful approach ensured that the family's reputation, though tarnished, could rebuild on a foundation of truth, while the village could heal and move forward. She understood that the balance between revealing wrongdoing and fostering communal harmony was delicate, yet attainable with patience, insight, and integrity. The stolen gold, once a symbol of betrayal, had become a catalyst for accountability and healing under her guidance. The morning after the village gathering was quiet, almost reverent. Obina sat with a bowed head, the weight of his actions settling fully upon him. The confessions, the evidence, and the public acknowledgement of his wrongdoing had stripped away any remaining facade of innocence. Neka watched him carefully, not with malice, but with a sense of measured expectation. This was a moment of reckoning, a chance for accountability and, ultimately, for redemption. The villagers, still processing the revelation, moved with cautious respect around the family compound. Conversations were hushed, and eyes occasionally lingered on Obinna, recognizing both his guilt and the courage required to face it publicly. Neka understood that rebuilding trust would not be instantaneous. It was a gradual process, requiring consistent honesty, transparent actions, and genuine effort to make amends for past wrongs. She began outlining steps for her father and the family to follow: restitution to those affected, open communication within the community, and visible efforts to repair damage done to relationships and reputation. Neka also guided her father through personal reflection. She encouraged him to confront not only the consequences of his actions but also the motivations behind them: the fear, the greed, and the desire to protect his image at the cost of integrity. By facing these internal truths, Obinna began to demonstrate remorse that was more than performative. It was a sincere acknowledgement of wrongdoing, coupled with the determination to act differently moving forward. The stolen gold, once a point of contention and secrecy, became a tool for reconciliation. Portions were returned to rightful owners, while others were used for community projects that Obinna had once mismanaged. Neka oversaw this process, ensuring transparency and fairness. In doing so, she subtly transformed a symbol of betrayal into a beacon of justice and renewal. Villagers gradually saw that accountability, when paired with tangible corrective action, could restore both trust and respect. Within the family, relationships began to shift. Conversations that had been avoided for years were reopened, questions previously left unanswered found clarity, and the atmosphere, once heavy with suspicion, lightened with cautious hope. Neka's presence served as both anchor and guide. Her wisdom, patience, and moral clarity helped the family navigate the uneasy terrain of rebuilding connections fractured by deception. Her leadership was quiet but undeniable. She did not dominate, but she illuminated the path forward with insight and integrity. As days turned into weeks, small but meaningful signs of progress appeared. Obinna demonstrated consistent honesty, engaged in reparative acts for those harmed, and sought counsel from respected village elders. The community began to acknowledge the family's efforts to restore balance, while Neka's role as mediator and guide became recognized not as authority imposed but as wisdom earned through observation, courage, and foresight. By the end of the first month, trust, though not fully restored, had been set on a trajectory toward healing. Neka realized that redemption was not a single event but a continuous process, a combination of acknowledgement, action, and sustained integrity. Through her careful guidance, the family learned that accountability, humility, and courage were the true foundations for rebuilding relationships, mending reputations, and ensuring that the shadows of past betrayal could eventually give way to light and trust once more. The day the gold was returned to its rightful place felt momentous, though it unfolded quietly without fanfare. Neka carefully oversaw the process, ensuring that every piece was accounted for and restored to its proper owners. What had once been a source of secrecy, fear, and betrayal now became a symbol of justice, transparency, and the triumph of truth over deception. Each coin and nugget was handled with reverence, not merely for its material value, but for the story it carried. The story of courage, integrity, and the power of discernment. Neka's meticulous attention to detail ensured that no part of the gold was misplaced or misappropriated again. She recorded its allocation, confirming that families and individuals affected by Obinna's schemes received not only their share of wealth but also acknowledgement for the losses they had endured over the years. The act of returning the gold was not simply a financial correction. It was a public demonstration of accountability, reinforcing the principle that material wealth is meaningless without honesty and ethical stewardship. As the villagers observed the process, a quiet admiration for Neka grew. They recognized that it was not her position, age, or status that had empowered her, but her intelligence, patience, and moral clarity. She had approached the tangled web of lies with careful observation, deliberate action, and an unwavering commitment to justice. In restoring the gold, she had restored faith in the family and in the broader principle that wrongdoing, when met with courage and integrity, must be addressed. Obinna, now humbled by both confession and action, watched as the gold was returned. Each placement of a coin or nugget seemed to strip away the weight of his past misdeeds, yet also reminded him of the importance of transparency and honor. Neka guided him through each step, her calm presence reinforcing that accountability is most effective when coupled with guidance and reflection. For her father, the act of restitution was both a personal reckoning and a lesson in humility, a tangible reminder that wealth cannot substitute for moral responsibility. Throughout the village, the return of the gold sparked conversation, reflection, and in some cases quiet relief. People who had been harmed by Obina's past actions began to see that their losses were acknowledged and partially rectified. The villagers' trust in the family, though cautious, began to rebuild on a foundation of honesty. Neka's careful orchestration demonstrated that justice could be restorative, rather than purely punitive, and that the community could move forward without lingering resentment if accountability was handled with integrity. The symbolism of the gold was profound. It represented the tangible consequences of hidden actions, the weight of responsibility carried across generations, and the clarity that arises when truth is pursued with patience and wisdom. Neka's triumph lay not only in uncovering the theft and her father's deeper crime but in transforming a source of greed and secrecy into a beacon of justice and moral clarity. The gold now stood as a testament to her courage, foresight, and dedication to what was right. As the sun set over the village, the restored gold gleamed softly in the fading light. It was no longer merely a possession but a story of accountability, redemption, and the undeniable truth that integrity cannot be bought or stolen. Neka's actions had ensured that wealth, when misused, could be corrected, and that honesty, courage, and wisdom would always hold a higher place than the lure of material gain. The gold's return marked the conclusion of one chapter and the beginning of a new era, where justice and integrity guided both family and community.